we're thinking about St. Paul, but we're also going to look at some people like Seneca, the ancient Roman philosopher, Stoic philosopher. And, for a lot of people, Seneca may seem like a highly unlikely person to be looking at if you're interested in talking about class struggle. And no doubt many would probably cringe at the idea, especially those in classics, at the kind of attribution of an anachronistic concept to an ancient figure. I get that a lot in biblical studies. Nonetheless, if trying to think about class struggle within the ancient world, it would do well to start from such a person place. Not least because Seneca has become a usual counterpoint, and in some scholarship a buttress, to Pauline gifting, the concept of gifting or grace or benefaction. And it is notable as well that both thinkers recognize the social implications of societal imperatives like gifting. Seneca, foremost as an elite figure, recognized that proper gifting realizes social harmony and promotes concord, a concern usual among ancient elite writers. This is something that likely many recognize in the ancient world, as gifting was encountered in everyday social situations. Like maybe you're aware that we encounter gifts today. Benefaction was a part of navigating everyday life. But social harmony normally benefits hegemony, prompting one to interrogate the telos, or the end of such social harmony, and the goals of gifting particularly. To make this a bit more obvious, social harmony solidifies class division, I think, reifying differences between elites and non-elites and all of their multiplicity, and subjecting non-elites to oppressive circumstances. While I do not want to spend an inordinate amount of time on the general, or social harmony kind of in general, I will note the particular, that is kind of the goals of gifting. And with that, I will in this talk, of course, focus on Paul and his kind of concepts, a little bit of benefaction, grace, and gifting, if I can get there. And most notably within some certain specific discourses going on in Paul, so his Roman discourse and his Corinthian discourse, hoping to kind of expose the subtle kind of ways that Paul may engage a bit in class struggle. So, this is following from work done by Marxist historians, perhaps the foremost classicist Marxist historian, G.E.M. de St. Croix. I'm probably saying his name horribly, but you can read it in a bit. And I will firstly insist that class struggle is an appropriate phenomenon to employ with regards to the Pauline or the ancient context, before turning to nuances of gifting in the ancient world and early Christianity, and finally, hopefully ending with some observations on Paul and how his kind of grace discussions, his gifting, his benefaction practices may point to moments of class struggle, especially in light of course, these Marxist-inspired works and contemporary kind of biblical studies and critical theory. So, Marxist readings of the early social situation of Christian groups are hard to escape, even in their relative absence and subsequent disappearance in the 20th century. Undoubtedly, Marxist historical work paved the way for later social material analysis, something that occurs most robustly after the renewal of interest in the social sciences among scholars investigating primitive Christianity. So despite a foundation laid by writers like Kautsky, Engels, and Marx, and other later New Testament people, New Testament scholars scoffed at the crude reductionism of Marxist historical analysis in the latter half of the 20th century. So you can note a well-known quote from a very well-known scholar, James T.G. Dunn, who's a New Testament scholar who's written lots of stuff about Paul and Jesus, of course, because that's mainly what the New Testament's about, who says, Jesus' call to and teaching on the poor are not reducible to some class war dogma. Quite strong language. And you encounter this all the time in New Testament study, the reductionism of Marxist analysis, or critical theory, or feminist criticism, or literary theory, all this kind of stuff. Our own Yvonne Sherwood has written an amazing book on the invention of the biblical scholar that talks about the sort of hysterical reaction that biblical scholars have towards these other modes of reading the Bible. So of course, what he's saying is not isolated among New Testament scholars. Nonetheless, much can be gleaned from class analysis done by explicitly Marxist historians and noted by later New Testament scholars to different degrees. Scholars like Stephen Friesen, who's really important, Justin Neggett, Larry Welburn, Del Martin, who was here last year for a talk for us, February 9th, so almost exactly a year ago. Richard Horsley and Neil Elliott, among many others, using this sort of stuff, even if some of them don't claim an explicitly Marxist kind of orientation. They've been influenced it. So St. Croix is perhaps the premier Marxist historian of antiquity in the 20th century, explicitly adopting terminology of class struggle to talk about the broad time period that early Christianity develops within, and much farther on. Despite the importance of St. Croix and Marx, because he talks about Christianity, and Engels, because he talks about Christianity, Gotsky, despite the importance of this guy and the importance of class struggle, it's been underutilized as a concept in New Testament studies. And too often it's been rejected because of undue skepticism, born of fear from being charged of being anachronistic. Perhaps the biggest heresy in New Testament studies. So biblical scholars on the margins that try to utilize methods like this are often sort of scoffed at or pushed further to the margins. So I'm supposed to change Bedfellows. Yes. Here we are. So before defending it as a legitimate concept of note within the context of early Christianity, class struggle, I want to point to some things that St. Croix says. And of course, this is not because I believe that I can add anything really significantly new to the legitimation of class struggle as a concept to be used by, when you're doing historical work. Such would be naive. Who am I? I'm just a PhD student who hasn't even finished his project yet, and is in an extension year, so I'm a nobody. But instead, it is my hope that I can still play my small part in pointing to what is a rather easy point, and that is that class struggle is not an anachronistic concept to apply to biblical text, no matter how one specifies the term. And St. Croix is used here to help legitimate the concept in New Testament studies, primarily because of his place in advocating for Marxist historical analysis, although, of course, the other biblical scholars that I've noted earlier shouldn't be ignored as well. So he relies on a definition of class that states it is a collective social fact of exploitation and the way in which exploitation is embedded in a social structure. Such concise descriptions allow for a wide range of attribution, but normally discussions of class include divisions of those inhabiting the productive classes and those that retain the means of that productivity, including, of course, divisions between renters and owners of property. Furthermore, while some have emphasized class struggle is being attached directly to the exploited and the exploiters, St. Croix points to other divisions within this binary, kind of breaking the binary apart, noting the importance of so-called intermediate classes, which were found between exploited and exploiters, and yet were still likely exploited by landowners and other elites in both direct and indirect ways. Now there are, of course, I mentioned that people get kind of pissy about this. They don't like this. This is anachronistic. How dare you use your Marxist criticism in my biblical studies? An example of this that perhaps exhibits some of the kind of reactions is affirmation of Del Martin for Marxist kind of criticism in the use of class as an important concept. He's been criticized. So one scholar, Bengt Holmberg, points to Del Martin's affirmation of Marxist conceptions of class in ancient history, quoting Martin, who writes, "Since class is a relation, those who live off the surplus labor value of others, no matter how wealthy or otherwise they are members of the propertied or upper class, whereas those whose labor provides the surplus value that supports the livelihood of others are members of the exploited class or classes." So this other guy, Holmberg, tries to poke holes in Martin's use of class analysis by claiming that this would, for instance, mean that Paul would be an elite, as would other pastors in the first century. Because Paul, if you're reading what he's doing, he's sort of going around to these different congregations and perhaps receiving assistance from them because he needs assistance or whatever. But such an application, what Holmberg is doing is, I think, misguided, as Martin's definition is, I think, meant to be more limited than he's allowing it. Otherwise, one would consider spouses and children, not to mention prisoners, as considered upper class or elite, or how he's dividing. So a prisoner, despite living off the surplus labor value of others, is not an elite part of society. They're an impoverished and oppressed part of society. Further examples would excuse such an unnecessary critique. When thinking of communal meals, it would not be the case that early Christians would have. It would not be the case that those who had the resources to provide food are necessarily divided by class type from those who are unable to contribute resources. Or if it is true that Pauline communal engagement included more long-term resource collection and allocation than just the Jerusalem project that he's engaged in, that you can see in many of his letters, then surely the recipients of resources would not be considered elite, while provisioners were non-elite. Instead, I think it would be best to maybe contextualize class, and thereby to allow the interpreter a dimension of flexibility when it comes to the applicability of the concept. Nuance is key, and such would be obvious to the researcher when utilizing any other method. So, kind of moving on to another section. Moving on from the importance of class and class struggle broadly considered, it's important to point out its importance, in particular with a few words about divisions and articulations of early Christian social stratification. So if we are concerned with how gifting may have worked, and more importantly, what it has to do with class struggle, it is paramount to note the demographics of specifically Pauline Christian associations. So it's well known among scholars that are working in this that there are lots of divisions about how to think about these early Christian communities and who's occupying these communities. The most striking sort of division among scholars would occur along the fault lines opened up by when scholar Justin Meggett's already classic work on Pauline communities and survival strategies. Pictured here, Fall, Poverty, and Survival, about 97, I think. So it seems a bit dated, but really, that wasn't that long ago. His thesis was oriented around destructuring the so-called new consensus models of early Christian communities. And these models, I think I'll talk about it later in here, but they kind of had some views of early Christian communities of being like, we got a lot of really poor people, but then we got these great sort of like really rich kind of elite figures, and they're giving their hard-earned money and resources to these poor people, and it's just a good old grand time. Good thing we have this great charity going on. Still, the back and forth is concerned with how bourgeois Pauline communities were. Were these communities mainly composed of hordes of impoverished, below-subsistence workers who were lucky enough to be deigned toward by the elite or near-elite members? Were these Christian communities the equivalent of the lordly tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, stooping down to fill the coffers of their less fortunate neighbors, or maybe building roller coasters for their wanting to unionize workers? So despite such important concepts mentioned above existing already, that you could fill out some disciplinary space within the study of early Christianity, very little has been done, even recently in New Testament studies, kind of utilizing class struggle, or class in general. In fact, a friend of mine he wrote a grant to try to get this really amazing postdoc, and the procedure for getting this grant was quite difficult, and You write out this long 10,000 word document, and then you submit it, and then you wait a few weeks, right, or a month or whatever, and then you get some great scholars in the area who reply to your amazing grant that you put forward. And they were quite upset that he used any discussion of class because, I thought we dropped that years ago. Well, no, if you know the discipline, you know that this is still going on. So still, this isn't used in New Testament studies. Of course, we've mentioned some of the important people just or two above, but what becomes obvious when surveying the literature is that class struggle has hardly been used to think about social functions and formations in early Christianity. Very briefly, I pointed to Seneca in the introduction, and I think it's time to sort of wrap back around and talk more explicitly about Seneca and why he's sort of important for what I'm trying to do here. He is, after all, a figure, right? So why is he important? So he is one of the writers who best lets us know about ancient perspectives on the concept of gifting. His De Beneficis, I don't speak Latin, I'm sorry, is a wonderful work of Stoic philosophy that probes proper social action when it comes to gifting. In the ancient world, gifting occupies a space that seems much different than it normally does in modern times. Or so many biblical scholars assert. So with this in mind, some scholars like John Barclay, a well-known New Testament scholar at Durham, spent a lot of time in his 2015 volume, Paul and the Gift, this giant, 600-page tome, laying out the vast gulf between modern readings of gifting and ancient, with a particular eye to Seneca, as kind of giving us some evidence to how ancient gifting is understood. Seneca considers gifting to be an absolute moral obligation, and even a thing of beauty, foremost because of its harmonious circularity. He points to, for instance, the cultural icon of the three graces, an image of three goddesses, maybe sisters, dancing hand in hand in a circle, and he exegesis thusly. So some would have it appear that there is one for bestowing a benefit, another for receiving it, and a third for returning it. Why do the sisters hand in hand dance in a ring which returns upon itself? For the reason that a benefit passing in its course from hand to hand returns nevertheless to the giver. The beauty of the whole is destroyed if the course is anywhere broken, and it has most beauty if it's continuous and maintains an uninterrupted succession. They are young because the memory of benefits ought not to grow old. The maidens wear flowing robes, and these too are transparent because benefits desire to be seen. What a beautiful little exegesis of this icon. Yes, yes. However, it is important to remember that Seneca is a privileged individual living in the ancient world. He also is simply one person who is philosophizing on gifting in a particular way from a Stoic perspective. Barclay notes that it should be remembered that this work is largely interpreted as a piece that is a, quote, restatement of largely common assumptions about gift reciprocity, concerned with providing an intelligent analysis of the problem of gift exchange, and concerned with advocating for Stoic solutions to these problems, with an aim of, and this is important, keeping the system of benefit exchange operational for the good of all. Underlining the good of all. This last point is perhaps one of the more important that I kind of want to highlight from looking at Seneca. While I admit fully that there needs to be care when extrapolating from a highly contextualized elite perspective to more encompassing, generalized one, there is importance in noting Seneca's concern with the good for all, and that is precisely because there is a more widespread desire for harmony and concord, an elimination of discord within the social body. Gifting is a reciprocal relation between diverse actors that forms an important part of the ancient social world, preserving harmonious relations. Now, of course, I could go on about other people. This isn't just Seneca. Del Martin, for instance, has written in one of his books, one of his most important books, The Corinthian Body, about the importance of concord and harmony, and as well, I think he mentions gifting in there as well, but there's plenty of work that talks about this, and so it's nothing really that's that I need to prove. You look up anything about gifting in the ancient world, it becomes quite obvious that this is important for social relations. That's all great, but I do, we've talked about now gifting in the ancient world. I do want to make a very minor excursus into gift in the modern world, because I know some of you, if I know you well enough, have been thinking, well, what about this lively discussion about gifting, in contemporary work? The foremost example, Derrida. Doesn't he talk about gifting and the impossibility of the gift? And there's all this other sort of work that's been done about the difficulty of talking about gift. And I do talk about this in my PhD much more with contemporary philosophers like Roberto Esposito and Jean-Luc Nancy and Agamben and others who touch on this briefly.